computer, and
Okay.
it has to convert it after
And I'll send
after
it
it
to
finishes,
you.
before you can send it out. Yeah.
I had a great breakthrough today with IT. Oh my goodness. Anyway, so I'm now mounting it on
Congratulations.
Canvas and we're all set. So it's a good day. Ashley, when you're ready.
Okay.
All right, everybody ready? Off we go. Good evening, everyone. We are delighted to welcome back Professor Ashley Greene, who is an assistant professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College. She's one of the triumvirate we have for our lecture series this semester, and we're delighted to have them. One of the best speakers on the subject. At Keene, Professor Greene teaches courses on genocide, modern Africa, human trafficking, and peace studies and transitional justice. Her research focuses on the relationship between history education and statecraft in Uganda. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Peacebuilding and Development and in several edited volumes. Professor Greene is also the Academic Programs Officer for Africa and Transitional Justice with the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. At the Institute, she develops and teaches atrocity prevention curricula for policymakers in Africa's Great Lakes District. Dr. Greene joins us today to speak of genocide and human trafficking in history, and we are very happy to welcome her back. Ashley.
Thank you so much, Diane, for the kind introduction. And thank you to all of you for letting me join you during what is just such a wonderful series. I look forward to this each time that I've been with you. So I'm absolutely delighted to be with you again tonight. So I want to start my time by talking about slavery. Slavery is the complete control of another person for purposes of exploitation. Now, today we consider slavery to be an atrocity crime. And when perpetrated systematically and widespread against a large number of people, to be a crime against humanity. But what does slavery have to do with genocide? Slavery as a concept has a contentious place in the field of genocide studies. And this contentious place stretches back in the history of genocide studies all the way back to the very first year that the United Nations Genocide Convention came into force in international law in 1951. And this contentious history becomes particularly apparent when a Black African-American civil rights activist and lawyer, William L. Patterson, presented a petition to the United Nations titled "We Charge Genocide," the historic petition of the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States government against the Negro people. And he presented this in Paris in 1951, in the same place that just 3 years before, Raphael Lemkin had sat to hear the vote to pass the Genocide Convention in 1948. So Patterson and the Civil Rights Congress very carefully applied the legacies of slavery in the American South to the articles of the Genocide Convention. And they did this by focusing on the crimes that took place under the Jim Crow laws in the United States, spanning a 7-year period from 1945 to 1951. And the petition opened with this chilling black and white photograph of a double lynching that took place in Columbus, Mississippi, and this forceful literary introduction that read, "Out of the inhuman Black ghettos of American cities, out of the cotton plantations of the South, comes this record of mass slayings on the basis of race, of lives deliberately warped and distorted by the willful creation of conditions making for premature death, poverty, and disease. It is a record that calls aloud for condemnation, for an end to these terrible injustices that constitute a daily and ever-increasing violation of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Now, in the petition, Patterson and the CRC cited more than 3,500 lynchings, pervasive legal discrimination, and systematic inequalities. Now, as you might imagine, this caused some concern among some proponents of the Genocide Convention. And in fact, Raphael Lemkin, the father of the Genocide Convention, the Jewish lawyer who coined the term genocide, was extremely critical of the petition and focusing on Patterson's commitment to the Communist Party and his commitment for communist values. Lemkin said that the petition was a communist ploy, likely trying to discredit the US and drawing attention away from atrocities that were being carried out in the Soviet Union. Now, this may have been in part because Lemkin was still very hopeful that the United States would ratify the Genocide Convention, and he really felt that if the Genocide Convention didn't have the support of the United States, it may not have the teeth it needed and the support that it needed to really be effective. And the US, as you know, didn't ratify the convention until 1988. But for whatever the reason, Lemkin's dismissal of the petition really presaged what became a very negative view within genocide studies of kind of the integration of slavery into the orbit of what we look at and study when we study genocide. And part of the concern for Lemkin, but also for future scholars of genocide, has been that genocide and slavery as terms would become conflated. And the fear was that if genocide began being used to describe other types of atrocities, that it would lose its moral power and the definition of genocide itself would become confused. So Michael Ignatieff in 2001 said, "Thus, slavery is called genocide when, whatever else it was a system to exploit the living rather than to exterminate them. Genocide has no meaning unless the crime can be connected to a clear intention to exterminate a human group in whole or in part." Other scholars pointed to the apparent contradictions between the crime of slavery and the crime of genocide. So the fact that they have motivations that seem to be complete opposites of one another, one being economic exploitation, slavery's motivation, and the other motivation being the destruction of an identity group. So Seymour Drescher, in a comparison of the transatlantic slave trade and the Holocaust, said, "As a way of death, the slave trade was kept in being by the maintenance of a continuous flow of living human bodies who were a means to the production of labor. The Holocaust was kept in motion by the production of dead bodies." So we have these two phenomenon that appear to be complete opposites, and yet throughout history and up to this current moment as we sit here together, we often see slavery and genocide happening at the same time. So whether it's the exploitation of Herero forced labor in Namibia under German colonial rule, the Nazi system of slave labor during the Holocaust, or the trafficking and sexual exploitation of women and children in Australia, Armenia, Bosnia, the Middle East, and China, slavery and genocide often go hand in hand. So over the next hour that we have together, and then I'll save time for some questions, I'd love to have a discussion with you. I want to challenge us to see what we might learn if we look at the ways in which slavery and genocide operate together, not as conflated crimes, but as two distinct atrocity crimes that frequently act as criminal co-conspirators co-conspirators. And I want to focus on these three questions. First, what can we learn about the relationship between genocide and human trafficking by looking at cases where the two atrocity crimes happen simultaneously? And we're going to look at crimes where slavery and genocide have been perpetrated by the same perpetrator group against the same victim group that they're trying to annihilate. Secondly, can we identify human trafficking as part of the genocidal process, or is it merely a side effect of genocidal violence? And finally, how can we understand, or how can understanding correlations between genocide and human trafficking inform genocide prevention and response? So when we talk about slavery, it's important to note that slavery falls legally and definitionally within this broader category of human trafficking and trafficking in persons. So the definition of trafficking in persons, just so that we're all kind of starting on the same page, here taken from the UN protocol revised in 2000, says trafficking in persons shall mean the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, fraud, deception, the abuse of power, or a position of vulnerability, or the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purposes of exploitation. I know that's a mouthful, but it's important to understand everything that can be included when we talk about human trafficking. And then they go on to say, very important, that exploitation shall include at a minimum the exploitation of the prostitution of others, other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery, or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs. So I want to provide you that broad definitional framework because I know you're very familiar with what genocide means as a legal term. And now I want to introduce this term of human trafficking and slavery, and we can look at them hand in hand together over a few case studies. So today, there are more than 40.5 million people living in slavery across the world. And sometimes when we hear about slavery, we tend to think that slavery is something that took place in the past and that ended with the abolition of systems like the transatlantic slave trade in the 1800s, or with the outlawing of slavery after events like the American Civil War. But slavery is very much alive and with us today. So in the more than 40 million people living in slavery, the Global Slavery Index, a study conducted a couple of years back, found that 22% of that slavery is sex trafficking and 78% is forced labor. And we're going to see in the cases we're going to look at that we'll see both operating very interconnectedly with the crime of genocide. So the first case that I want to talk with you about is the case of the genocide against the Herero in German Southwest Africa. And I'll come back to the present day in our last case study, but this is going to start us with what was really the first genocide of the 20th century. And this was also the first German genocide and the first time that Germany used concentration and death camps to annihilate a people. So like many European countries in the 1800s, Germany joined the scramble for Africa, securing colonies in German Southwest Africa, today Namibia, in Togo and Cameroon, and in German East Africa, which is today Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. Now, in German Southwest Africa, which Germany colonized in 1884, Germany undertook a project of settler colonialism. And central to this German settlement project was the concept of Lebensraum. And if you've studied the Holocaust, you've probably heard of this term before. And the idea was coined in 1897 by a German geographer and ethnographer named Friedrich Ratzel. And Ratzel was writing at a time of increasing population density in German cities, especially Berlin, and amidst the rise of urban poverty. So as he was writing, Ratzel argued that the Volk, or the German people, needed geographic space and they needed to expand their territory as their population increased, or they risked perishing from lack of resources. And Ratzel built the Lebensraum theory on the premise that superior cultures destroy inferior cultures in battles for living space. So in his 1891 book, Anthropogeography, or Political Geography, he advanced the theory that dying out is the predestined fate caused by the inner weakness of individual races. And he felt that the decline of peoples of inferior culture happened from contact with superior cultures. So this was very much a colonial idea, a settler colonial project, and one that historian Dirk Moses has argued in many ways was a project that was exterminatory in its very structure and conception because of the inherent racism and the need to remove what's already there so that you can replace it with the superior culture. So by 1903, only a little more than 4,600 Germans had settled in German South Africa. And part of this had to do with the fact the land already belonged to a people known as the Herero and a number of other people groups as well, the Nama being one, for example. The Herero were a formidable people and they had trade networks that gave them access to modern firearms and technology. They were not a people that would be easily pushed off of the land. And they were very wealthy thanks to their skills in cattle farming. So German settlers, and I have a couple of photos up for you to look at, one being from a little bit later up at the top right of a German Namibian family, and one on the left a bit earlier of a Herero family, and then one final one down right of a more modern Herero women. But German settlers come to the colony, and as you can see from the map in the middle, they have these grand ideas and these ambitious schemes, and they find themselves in this very unsettling position of having to rent land from the Herero and buy cattle from them. And this didn't match up well with their ideas of and self-perceptions of their own culture as being superior to the Herero. So as they come with a very aggressive racist attitude. And a German governor of German Southwest Africa, Governor Leutwein, said, quote, "The Europeans flooding into Herero land were inclined with their inborn feeling of belonging to a superior race to appear as members of a conquering army." So as Germany settles the colony, Black Africans in Namibia were beaten, flogged, raped, and killed with impunity. And perhaps even more devastating for the Herero, German settlers and soldiers began working together to steal the Herero's cattle, which underpinned the Herero's economic and social structure and also served as the basis and the linchpin of their religious beliefs too. Cattle were very, very important to the Herero. And this served two purposes in the minds of the German settlers. First, it ensured that German settlers would obtain the Herero's wealth, but they also believed that it would force the impoverished Herero to work as wage laborers for German farmers who were desperate not only for land and cattle, but also for labor. So when a group of Herero rebels against German rule in 1904, German military officials in the colony decide to pursue their annihilation. So the commander of the German colonial army, his name was Lieutenant General Lothar von Trotha, said, quote, "No war may be conducted humanely against non-humans." And on October 2nd of 1904, he issued what we know of as an extermination order against the Herero. And I've put up an excerpt from you that read, "The Herero are no longer German subjects. The Herero people will have to leave the country. If the people refuse, I will force them with cannons to do so. Within the German boundaries, every Herero, with or without a gun, with or without cattle, will be shot. I won't accommodate women and children anymore. I shall drive them back to their people, or I shall give the order to shoot at them. These are my words to the Herero people. Now, just a little bit later in that same month of October, he also said this: that nation must vanish from the face of the earth. So this is one of those cases of genocide where the intention, the genocidal intent is very, very clear. We don't often get this smoking gun, right? That's written on paper so clearly. And over the next several months, the German colonial army under von Trotta massacred Herero systematically and pushed them into the Oaxaca desert, where they poisoned the water holes to ensure that they would perish there. And I'm going to play for you a very brief 4-minute clip that's going to introduce this period of the genocide and then explain why it suddenly pivots and shifts directions.
On the 1st of October, 2 months after the Battle of Waterberg, von Trotta and a group of German soldiers reached the waterhole of Asombo Windimbe. The next morning, von Trotta read out a proclamation to his troops.
I, the great general of the German soldiers, send this letter to the Herero people. Within the German borders, every Herero, with or without a gun, will be shot. I will no longer accept women and children.
The important thing about Asombo Windimbe is the putting down into writing an official sanctioning of genocide. Why did this take place? I think that the situation had reached an extent where the German military believed that this was perfectly acceptable. They did not see that this was possibly controversial.
The Herero people must leave the land. If they do not do this, I will force them with the cannon. These are my words to the Herero people, the great general of the mighty Kaiser.
The thousands of starving Herero in the Oaxaca now seemingly had no hope. But in Berlin, the news of von Trotta's extermination order was a shock. The army and its supporters in the Reichstag had badly misjudged the changeable mood of the German people.
When news of the brutality with which Trotta and his troops are putting down the uprising reaches Germany, there are huge and radical protests, above all in the Reichstag, above all among the Centre Party. On this issue, they are radically opposed to the actual policies being conducted. And there are also newspaper articles. It's a national scandal, if you like.
Despite the scandal, the Kaiser refused to order von Trotta to rescind his extermination order. For 2 further months, the Hereros were hunted down in the Oaxaca, until finally the government forced the Kaiser's hand. On the morning of the 9th of December, a telegram was sent ordering von Trotta to accept the surrender of the Herero. The German army now began patrols to collect what was left of the Herero people. 13,000 were rounded up. Soldiers took photographs of their work. After 6 months being hunted by the German army, the Herero were terrified and untrusting. To persuade them to surrender, German soldiers and missionaries told the Herero that they'd been pardoned by the Kaiser and would now be allowed to return to their homelands. But this was a lie. What Germany now began was an extension of their policy of extermination, using more efficient 20th century methods. Here, by the old German fort in Windhoek, the capital of modern Namibia, lies the site of Germany's first mass concentration camp. In this tiny space, over 4,000 people were beaten, worked, and starved to death by the army of the Second Reich. What happened here and in other camps across this country is something that few people in Germany and Namibia have been willing to confront. But this is where the Herero collected by the army were sent, and where the first genocide of the 20th century reached its terrible conclusion.
So when von Trotta miscalculates the reaction that the genocide has amongst the German public, and he's ordered to accept the Herero's surrender, we see this very significant turning point in the genocide. At this point, approximately 65,000 Herero have died in the genocide, and that's 80% of the Herero population. And what we see at this moment, when the height of the threat that they pose to Germany is really past, we see the Herero nation decimated, and the survivors, approximately 13,000, who were predominantly, though not all, women and children, were malnourished, sick, and really completely defenseless. And so at this point, under orders to rescind the extermination policy, officials in German Southwest Africa pivot from outright killings of Hereros to the killing of Herero through slave labor. And what is a very chilling foreshadowing to what Germany will do under the Nazis just 30 or so years later, the colonial army places Herero in concentration camps, or concentration slaughers. And these camps are very different from the methods that had previously been used in British South Africa or by the Spanish in Cuba, where camps were really used just to separate people from one another. These camps were very much places of death, where the Herero and later another people group called the Nama on Shark Island were really placed where they were meant to die out and perish. But rather than kill them immediately, between 1905 and 1908, the Germans used the Herero for slave labor and loaned them out as slaves to private companies. So after rounding up the surviving Herero, the Germans built concentration camps at Windhoek, where we believe approximately 4,000 people were kept, and at several other sites in the colony. And here they began transporting them in cattle cars to sites of labor. So two concentration camps, for example, were built in Swakopmund. This was really the colony's main port that you can see shaded in gray. It was also the industrial hub at the time. And the Herero at Swakopmund were forced to unload ships that came into the port and to work on a number of new building projects. And I'll return to this map just for a second, because what you can see in this map on the right is really the ambition of Germany's building plans for the colony. They projected railways, roads, postal routes, heliograph lines. That's the mirrors that you put a mirror and they shine light and then they connect to one another. And all of these projects needed labor in order to bring them into reality. So they had people working on all of these colonial projects using the slave labor of the Herero to build the colony itself. Now, and Germans were very bureaucratic about this, and they recorded these crimes and left us a number of records. So for example, they created a tag and a number for each Herero slave, and they put these on metal tags, which you can see that the young men are wearing around their necks on the bottom left photograph. And these tags were made in Germany and shipped to the colony. So I think it's important that we know this wasn't unknown in Germany, especially not within the upper echelons of the Second Reich. The Germans then lent the Herero as slave laborers to private companies, much like Jews would be lent to private companies later in the Holocaust. And this included shipping and railway companies, and they received 10 German marks per month for each person. So this would have been roughly between $100 and $150 a month in today's US dollars. So the Herero were exploited for their labor this way until they died. And if you go today to the Windhoek archives, you can find 14 volumes of death registers documenting the people who died this way. And the records listed a person's number, age, gender, and the company or project on which they were working and their cause of death. And the most common cause of death was death through exhaustion. And in fact, it was so common for people to perish in this way that the Germans made pre-printed death certificates listing death through exhaustion as the cause of death. So just as an example, between 1906 and 1907, the private railway company, the Lenz Company, received 2,014 Herero prisoners to help build a railway line to Lüderitz. Within 6 months, 1,359 of those prisoners had died. That's more than 67% death rate. So in 1909, before I start our next case, when the camps are closed, very few Herero survivors are then sold off as slaves to German farmers. And in German Southwest Africa, we can see what I want to show is that slavery was used as a means of developing the colony, as a means of profit, and also as a way to continue the very annihilation of the Herero people. So the next case I want to speak about is the case of Australia. And this is a case that spans decades of the 20th century. It involves a different type of human trafficking, the forced removal of women and girls. And with this case, we'll be looking at the ways in which human trafficking, both forced labor, but in particular sex trafficking, play a role in genocides that use biological absorption as a key method of annihilation. So as you probably know, in the late 18th century, the British began using Australia as a settler colony for British convicts. So like German settlers in Namibia, British settlers in Australia brought with them their ideologies based on notions of cultural superiority and racism that would shape their encounters with indigenous peoples that they found on the continent. And one of the very powerful and deadly ideologies that shaped these relationships was the belief that primitive civilizations were destined to be replaced by more advanced societies. And this was an ideology built on constructs of race and collective identity. And this was a racist eliminationist ideology. It also tied into ideologies about the importance of cultivation. This idea that was imparted in part through the works of writers like Samuel Pufendorf. I know he sounds like a character in a Harry Potter novel, but he was actually a 17th century author who believed and wrote about humanity's development in 4 stages of humanity, where he placed agriculturalists and commercial societies at the very top and hunters and gatherers at the very bottom, because they had failed to properly cultivate or make use of the land. And so oftentimes when colonial policies begin to have a devastating impact on colonized peoples, their demise is seen as an inevitable byproduct of historical progress. And this was sometimes known as the doomed race theory. And there was a saying that develops in colonial discourse known as smoothing the pillow of the doomed race. In other words, helping them along towards their inevitable extinction, smoothing the pillow. So in Australia, the settlers who arrived needed access to Aborigine land for cultivation of their crops and livestock. Among other endeavors, they had brought herds of sheep with them from Europe. And if they were going to make the colony successful and self-sustaining, they needed access to the land to make it possible. In Australia, in the 1800s through the 1900s, we see large-scale violence begin to happen between white settlers and Aborigines. And when Aboriginal groups begin pushing back against settler encroachment by raiding their farms and their livestock. We see this violence escalate into indiscriminate massacres, men, women, and children. So in Queensland, for example, you see a state militia pursuing men, women, and children, regardless of whether or not they had been involved in raids. And we see between 8,000 and 10,000 Aborigines killed in this period of time in the mid and late 1800s. So this map that I started with by Judy Watson is part of a multimedia mapping project, and she's depicted more than 250 massacre sites where this frontier violence took place against Aboriginal peoples. Now, in the 19th century, the late 19th century, the Australian government begins implementing a series of policies to deal with the Aboriginal problem. And the first of these was called protection legislation. And this placed Aboriginal peoples into heavily regulated reserves. And these reserves were extremely isolated. They offered very few opportunities. And the expectation, again, remember this doomed race theory, the expectation was that the people placed and segregated into these reserves would just eventually die out. But what the Australian authorities did with people of mixed descent, which they referred to as half-castes, was very different. And they believed that through interracial relationships, often non-consensual, that these people could be biologically absorbed into the white population. And this later becomes linked to a policy of removing children from Aboriginal families, placing them in boarding schools or residential schools, which I'll talk about in a moment. And these were the assimilation policies. But what matters for the question we're asking today is that Australia accomplished this task through a system of labor exploitation and sexual violence. So what I want to do next is show you a very brief clip from Rabbit Proof Fence that shows a figure named Auber Octavius Neville, or A.O. Neville, who is a chief protectorate of Aborigines in Western Australia. And he's talking here about Australia's policy of biological absorption. And I want you to take note of who he's talking to, and we're going to come back to that when it's finished.
Notice, if you will, the half-caste child, and there are ever increasing numbers of them. Now, what is to happen to them? Are we to allow the creation of an unwanted third race? Should the coloureds be encouraged to go back to the black? Or should they be advanced to white status and be absorbed in the white population? Now, time and again, I am asked by some white man, if I marry this coloured person, will our children be black? And as Chief Protector of Aborigines, it is my responsibility to accept or reject those marriages. Here is the answer. 3 generations. Half-blood grandmother, quadroon daughter, octoroon grandson. Now, as you can see in the 3rd generation, or 3rd cross, no trace of native origin is apparent. The continuing infiltration of white blood finally stamps out the black color. The Aboriginal has simply been bred out. Now.
Okay, so why is he speaking to a group of white Australian housewives? He's speaking to these women because when the girls would be taken from the reserves and placed into these schools where they would be stripped of their Aboriginal identity, they were overseen by boards with very ironic names like Protection Board or Aboriginal Welfare Board. But these boards would oversee the placement of these girls as domestic servants for white families. So these women that he was speaking to were the connection point between the Aboriginal Protection Boards and the families that the girls were indentured to. Now, and I'm going to go to that quote in a minute. The families paid the board directly, and in theory, the boards held the money in trust to be returned to the girls after their indentured service ended. In practice, however, and this is very important, very few of them ever received this money. So the vast majority of girls put into this system were experiencing from start to finish a system of slave labor. And this was also a system of immense and widespread sexual exploitation. The idea of biological absorption was that marriages and intercourse between Aboriginal women and white men would produce in several generations entirely white children. And simultaneously, with all Aboriginal men being confined to reserves, the birth rate between Aboriginal couples as their women were removed would disappear. So the protection policies, the absorption policies, and then the assimilation policies, the removal of children, are all supporting one another in this very terrible way. And this can be seen quite powerfully by the primary source documents and the statements that we have from the men and women on the protection boards. So here we have one that's in a great article by Victoria Haskins. And it says the primary intention of the board in removing and indenturing Aboriginal girls was, as stated by one of its members in 1912, to quote, put things in train on the lines that would eventually lead the Aboriginal camps being depleted of their population and finally of the closing of the reserves and camps altogether. So we see here this smoothing of the pillow, right, of the doomed race. Now, also, researcher Victoria Haskins notes in New South Wales, where Aboriginal girls were particularly targeted for removal, the New South Wales Aboriginal Welfare Board records for the 1920s and 30s show remarkably high rate of pregnancy for girls indentured to service. So apart from this idea of mixed race marriages, officials and the men and women connected with these protection boards knew that the girls sent into domestic service were experiencing extraordinarily high rates of sexual exploitation and rape. Now, instead of changing their policies, the Aboriginal welfare boards overseeing the system of removal from the girls from the reservations step up this assimilation and absorption policy. And while this clearly fits the definition of slavery and human trafficking, you also know, because you've been studying genocide, that the forcible transfer of children from one group to another by itself can constitute genocide if done with the intent to destroy a national, racial, ethnic, or religious group. So the case of Australia helps us understand how this policy of forced removal, when combined with forced labor and sex trafficking, was such a devastating tool of genocide. And I want to play one more short clip from A Rabbit-Proof Fence, which shows, it's a true story, the film, of two Aboriginal girls. And this is highlighting the assimilation policies that focused on removing girls from the Aboriginal reserves.
Come and get your rations. Hurry up.
Got no saying.
No, Mum!
Listen, move 1 inch and I'll lock your mother up. That was their legal guardian. Come on, little one. You sit up and you stay. I got the papers, Maud. No, Dana. No. Got no saying it. Come on. The three of us, don't move. There's nothing you can do here, old girl. Nothing you can do.
Now, I think that's a very difficult clip to watch, but it's important, and I think it helps us understand why, when we're dealing with Article 2E of the Genocide Convention, the forcible transfer of children from one group to another, legally and definitionally, the number of people that has to be killed for a case to be genocide is actually 0, because this is so devastating for people. Now, these children, these girls that would be removed, were taken to these boarding schools and lent out as domestic servants or slaves to white Australian families. And the policymakers knew about the sexual exploitation taking place. For example, at first in New South Wales, they even placed restrictions on apprenticing particularly dark-skinned girls to white families because they believed it would be, quote, impossible of their being merged into the white population. In 1916, however, this restriction was removed and the board secured legislative power to remove all Aboriginal girls 14 years old and over to place them in indentured service. And we know that in reality, they were often taken much younger, as young as 9, 10, or 11 years old. So by the 1930s, incidences of sexual exploitation and assault and the resulting pregnancies of these assaults were so common that officials had to form policy responses to this. So in 1937, at the Conference of Commonwealth and State Aboriginal Authorities, A.O. Neville shared the following policy in response to girls and women of mixed descent who were sent into domestic service. And he said, our policy is to send them out into the white community. And if a girl comes back pregnant, our rule is to keep her for 2 years. The child is then taken away from the mother and sometimes never sees her again. Thus, these children grow up as whites, knowing nothing of their own environment. At the expiration of the period of 2 years, the mother goes back into service. So it really does not matter if she has half a dozen children. And, you know, if we sit with this for a moment and imagine the heartbreak and the horror of what's happening to these women and these girls, that they would be treated in this way and then, you know, have the baby. The period of 2 years is likely because that's often the amount of time that a baby nurses or breastfeeds. So 2 years that a girl would get to know her child, might possibly form feelings of love for her child, and then to have that child ripped away and raised with a white family and thrown back into the same situation so that it could happen to her over and over again. And they knew this and were okay with it because it served their larger goals of annihilation and absorption. So these three policies, all of which connect to the definition of human trafficking, fed into one another in a systematic and a terrifying way to form a genocidal program that scholar Robert Van Krijken has described as, quote, breeding out color of both body and mind. And I have pictures here that you can see from one of the schools. It's being visited by an official here. And you can see not just the children, how young they are, but also you can see on the right-hand side several babies that would have been born there. And the babies that were born, as I said, were given away to Australian families. So the final case that I'm going to talk about in our final 10 minutes before we start our discussion together is the ongoing case of genocide against the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, China. In 2014, Chinese President Xi Jinping launched the People's War on Terror in a region of Xinjiang known as the XUAR. Now, a year earlier, let me start with this quote of his. He said in this, a government official announced, "Round up everyone who should be rounded up, wipe them out completely, destroy them root and branch, break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections, and break their origins." And I have a feeling, since you've been studying genocide this semester, this language is probably a red flag for you, and you probably can see the very genocidal language being used here. Now, a year earlier, in May 2013, the government released documents laying out the plans for mass internment campaign where Uyghurs and Muslim minorities would be rounded up, moved, or trafficked into internment camps. Now, in March of last year, 2021, the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy published a report in which they described the genocide against the Uyghurs as a logical result of a series of cumulative and sequential acts. And I want to just talk about some of these very quickly to give you a historical background to the case. But first of all, the Communist Chinese Party, or the CCP, has been concerned about the ethnic makeup of the Xinjiang region for a number of decades, beginning in the 1950s. And they responded to this by beginning to encourage Han Chinese migration to the region to try and change the ethnic demographics there. And they did this very successfully. So the Han population in 1953 grew from around 6% to more than 40% in 1982. So in just about a 30-year period of time. But in the 1980s, Beijing begins to feel concerned about the rise of ethno-nationalism and religious revival that's happening among Uyghurs, and they start banning certain books and material, restricting religious education, and kind of becoming, cracking down on the Uyghur identity. So in the early 2000s, we begin to see the labeling of Uyghurs. This is one of Gregory Stanton's 10 stages of genocide, as terrorists, despite very little evidence of terrorist activity at this time, and also being labeled as disloyal, untrustworthy, and backwards. And so amidst these increasingly restrictive and discriminatory policies, including forced migration of Uyghurs to mainland China, a number of Uyghurs stage a protest in Urumqi in 2009, and we see more violent pushback amongst a minority of Uyghurs. And this protest turned violent when Chinese security forces intervened. And at this point, the Chinese state militarizes the region, and people in rural areas have to obtain special cards to travel outside their towns. Traditional events are banned, and the state criminalizes private religious education and education in the Uyghur language. In 2014, the Chinese government embarks on a massive surveillance campaign that President Xi called, quote, nets spread from the earth and sky. And they installed thousands of high-definition cameras and facial recognition software to monitor people's facial expressions, to look for signs of dissent. And some cities were spending upwards of $46 million on these surveillance systems. Talk about the connection of genocide and modern technology. So the Xinjiang Production Construction Corps, the XPCC, is a secretive paramilitary organization. It also operates prisons, internment camps, and labor camps, and it answers directly to the government. It was one of the groups that initially colonized this Han Chinese migration into the region. You can see photos of that on the top right. So the government did a number of things. They firstly encouraged cadres to do homestays with Uyghur families, where they began documenting behavior and they took over the education of children. They incentivized marriages between Han Chinese and Uyghur women by providing married couples with an annual stipend and educational and career opportunities. Now, this had a darker side as well, with the coercion of Uyghur women into unwanted marriages with Han Chinese men by threatening to place them or their family members into internment camps. And this falls under the United Nations definition of human trafficking through forced marriage. So from a prevention standpoint, I just want to point out, if we look to human trafficking as a possible indicator or a risk sign of genocide, especially when it connects to this idea of biological absorption, by 2014, this is 8 years ago, we would have had reason to be gravely concerned about what was happening in China. Now, by 2016, China had expanded and advanced its surveillance program to include biodata that collected during mandatory medical examinations and physicals, people's retinal scans, face scans, voice prints, prints of a person's gait or their walk, fingerprints, DNA, and blood type. And this information was all put into a system called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, or the IJOP. And along with information collected at smartphone checkpoints for people's cell phones and on Wi-Fi networks, this was integrated into an algorithm that was used to identify the people that would be placed in the internment camps. And I want to put up here just very quickly to remind you this trafficking in persons definition, and to point out the abuse of power in particular is very, very relevant in this case. One of the many ways people can find themselves trafficked. So in the 7-day period in June 2017, security officials sent 15,683 residents of these 4 prefectures to internment camps and arrested 706 residents, placing more than 2,000 under preventative surveillance, all solely based on the IJOP algorithm and data. So I want to highlight how this is being used to funnel people into internment camps, to select who's going to be trafficked into these internment camps. And so this camp system in 2016, we see it step up with local police confiscating passports. The Justice Department begins constructing a more massive system of internment camps that they called concentrated transformation through education centers. More than 380 sites were constructed or expanded since 2017. The camps now include more permanent infrastructures, for example, to block out natural light, more guard towers and security, and new facilities. There are 14 sites still under construction as of March 2021. And we know this from aerial drone footage. China's obviously very closed to reporters. It can be difficult to get information, but we have surveillance that shows us that they're still, as of last year, expanding this system of concentration camps. It's believed that between 1,300 and 1,400 internment facilities exist in Xinjiang, excluding prisons that were there before, and that they hold somewhere between 1 and 2 million detainees. We also know that extreme force and violence is used to control and torture the prisoners. Government documents that accompany the building of these camps show, and some of this has been through leaked information, but they show procurement requests from local governments for weapons like electric cattle prods, electric batons, tasers, spiked clubs, spears, stun guns, tear gas, pepper spray, handcuff, and police uniforms. We also know that there's been a transfer of orphaned children who are orphaned because both parents have been interned, and a transfer of those orphaned children to Han Chinese families or to educational re-education centers and orphanages where they're raised to be Han Chinese and indoctrinated into that ethnic identity. Now, this has been accompanied by a systematic forced labor and sex trafficking operation in Xinjiang by the Chinese government. And here I have from a 2019 local government work report, a quote that says, "For every batch of workers that is trained, a batch of employment will be arranged and a batch will be transferred. And those employed need to receive thorough ideological education and remain in their jobs." So in other words, these people are being interned, abused, indoctrinated, or re-educated. And once they're considered safe or sufficiently re-educated, they are then loaned out to private factories and government subsidized factories and companies in the region. And the region's one of China's main cotton suppliers, as well as a number of other textile factories, etc. Now, from the beginning of the internment camp system, we know that women have been particularly targeted for violence. And we have, for example, this eyewitness account of a woman who escaped the camps and tells us of her role that she was forced to serve in removing women's clothing, handcuffing them in a room, leaving them, and then ushering in a Chinese man from outside, or a police or a security guard. And she says, "I sat silently next to the door, and when the man left the room, I took the woman for a shower. The Chinese men would pay money to have their pick of the prettiest young inmates." And in her testimony, we learned very importantly that a number of these men came in wearing suits, which tells us that these are Chinese civilians, men who are working in the corporate sector, going about their business day, and then coming and purchasing essentially a sex slave to rape. So this is very important. It tells us this is sex trafficking, not merely the assault of women by security guards in the camps. So we also know that Uyghur women have been targeted for sexual violence, forced sterilization and forced abortions, violence targeting reproductive areas, and the intentional targeting of people of childbearing age. So the demographics of the internment camps show us that people who are childbearing age are being specifically targeted for trafficking. And a leaked list known as a Caracas list cites the two most common reasons for detention are, first of all, birth policy violations. So if you've had too many children, or unsafe post-80s, 90s, or 2000s persons. And that would be people between 18 and 40 years of age. And we know from another report that found that between 2015 and 2018, growth rates in the two largest areas for Uyghur populations had decreased by 84%. And in 2019, in prefectures such as Kashgar and Hotan, we saw that only 3% of married Uyghur women who were of an age to bear children gave birth, 3%. One prefecture, that of Kyzyl, the birth rate was 1.05% in 2020. So the government is not denying these figures. In fact, in September 2020, the Xinjiang government sent a letter to CNN attributing these statistics, quote, to the comprehensive implementation of the family planning program. And in the letter, they cited the fact that in 2018, the number of babies born to Uyghur women decreased by 120,000 compared to the year before. So again, I want to end and close by putting these two definitions up together and asking us, why does genocide cause such outrage while slavery may go completely unnoticed by contemporary onlookers? Should we see slavery as a potential stage in the genocidal process, or in some cases, very much a continuation of genocide by different means, while in other cases, biological absorption and sex trafficking can be the height of the genocide itself? So the argument I want to leave, and I'm so excited to hear what you think and answer your questions, is that throughout the 20th century, slavery and human trafficking have been used to fund, commit, and secure genocide. To fund genocide, slave labor and sex trafficking have been used to build and enrich genocidal states and their architectures, to fund genocidal activities, to benefit citizens of the majority or perpetrator group. Human trafficking has been used to commit genocide, just in one instance by isolating children from their parents. The control of women and sexual exploitation has facilitated genocide through biological absorption, and people have been killed through slave labor itself as a means of death. And securing the legacies of genocide, forced labor and enslavement removes victims from the fabric of society. Those people who are enslaved are not contributing to the economic, social, or political life of the country. They're not in front of classrooms. They're not making music. They're not contributing to mathematical theories, all the ways that we create the fabrics of our societies. They are isolated from. And finally, it keeps victim groups in a perpetual state of vulnerability and exploitation. So I want to propose that human trafficking can serve as an early warning sign for genocide when targeted towards collective identity groups. Maybe if we saw this as more of a significant warning sign, we could target upstream prevention strategies earlier. For example, the US is just now processing legislation called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, years and years after this has started. And traditional justice responses and downstream prevention efforts could take into account the consequences and legacies of slavery on victim groups to provide more support. So my final remarks are just to say that, the point is not to say that slavery is genocide or human trafficking is genocide, but to see that when human trafficking occurs in the context of genocide, there are significant relationships and correlations that could help us understand genocide better. And I'll leave this up as we talk. For those who might be wondering how you might get involved, there's so many wonderful organizations, both focused on genocide and slavery, and also on the plight of women in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. So thank you so much. I want to leave time for questions. I've probably overtalked already, so I can't wait to hear from you.
Oh, not at all, Ashley. We could listen to you a lot longer. That is such a rich, and it's such a troubling lecture. Just there's so much to think about. It's just difficult to take in all at once. And I'm sure we have many questions in the audience. Please submit them through the question and answer forum on your computer, and I'll be glad to ask them for you. One of our students says, "This is so sad. Did any other countries try to put an end to the Germans' genocide against the Herero?"
So that's a great question. The Herero were illiterate people, like I said, a very interconnected people, and they actually wrote letters to the British, who also had colonies in South Africa and around that region. And the British said essentially that they couldn't help because they had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany. So the British did not go to the Herero's aid. What they did do, interestingly, again, they were rivals with Germany and were about to come up onto World War I. They they collected eyewitness accounts into what's called the British Blue Book. And there's a fabulous reprint of that. I highly recommend it. It's a collection of accounts collected by the British on the ground at the time and by people who committed testimonies. And so at the very least, we have a lot of evidence and records, but they didn't step in to stop it.
Another student says, "You are such a wonderful speaker. Thank you for this very insightful talk." And another member of our audience says, "Not a question, but thank you greatly for your time and your commitment to studying the history of such a dark and tumultuous topic." Another question is, what within our power can we do to help genocide, slave labor, and sex trafficking be stopped? Is there anything that we as motivated students can do?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked, and I'll point you again. I'll make sure that you have my slides, especially that one at the end. They're fabulous organizations that have come so far in understanding how we free people from slavery. And one of the primary ways is by providing them alternative sources of employment and income. So by supporting organizations that are working locally to train people in a trade or a vocation. Secondly, by providing them education about their human rights. So many of these people, slavery is often targeted towards people who are vulnerable and they don't know what their rights are and they don't have access to lawyers or people who could defend them. But there are so many organizations who are doing this work and they can use our support, not just financially by donating, but even by people supporting their campaign efforts online to raise awareness, to educate others about this. And finally, we can educate ourselves about what it looks like to be a modern day slave so that when we're traveling in airports or just in our own cities, this is in our own backyard. And we can know how to spot someone who looks fearful, who doesn't speak the language, who doesn't have access to their passport or documents. And we can know the hotlines to call to get people help.
Yeah, that's a very interesting comment because we could easily be walking down the street and passing by people who are being trafficked every day.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we just need to keep an eye out for where it might be happening. How did the Herero gain access to modern weapons?
So it was through trade networks along the coast and the continent. And, you know, trade with Europe and Africa started as early as the 14 and 1500s. And so by this time, there had been a large amount of trade. The transatlantic slave trade had happened and had ended. So you have this long history of encounters between people groups, and people were trading for, among other things, modern weaponry and rifles, and the Herero had access to those through their trade and their cattle that they were able to trade for these things with.
Are there many Herero people still alive today?
There are descendants of the Herero, and this is such a fascinating question because for years and years, Germany refused to recognize what happened. And finally, they did this partial recognition where they recognized that what von Trotta did was genocide, but they refused to recognize that what took place later in the concentration camps was genocide. And yet there are such terrifying parallels to the Herero genocide and the Holocaust, not least that Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf quoted some of these thinkers like Friedrich Ratzel and Eugene Fischer, who created a racial science program that sent Herero skulls to German universities that then funded Josef Mengele. So the Herero descendants for so long have been fighting for recognition. Now, last year, Germany fully recognized what took place and very controversially committed more than $1 billion as foreign development aid to Namibia. Now, they did not call this reparations. And this has left many feeling deeply unsatisfied because the Herero primarily are fighting to get their land back, which is still some of the best land is held by farmers of German descent in Namibia. So the Herero feel that this was not targeted to the descendants and survivors, but as a general foreign aid, could even be looked at as neocolonialism in terms of building the infrastructure of the colony as a whole. So there's fierce debate about this, people who see it as a great step, and then many Herero who say it's not enough.
Is there any evidence that the Namibian government is directing this aid to the benefit of the Herero?
So it's too early to say. This is breaking news as of last year. And so I gave a talk on this to a foreign development office, and there are other governments who are wondering, is this a good idea? Is this a good way to make repair to past colonies? We don't know yet. The Herero fear is that it's going to not be targeted towards the Herero. Germany's position was it will be used selectively to develop people like the Herero who are still socioeconomically disadvantaged. How will it turn out? They're promising this aid over a number of decades, so we'll see. Stay
Wow.
tuned, I guess.
Constant issue with foreign aid. What evidence is there that the Australians are becoming more sensitive to the idea of reparations for the Aborigines?
Sure, great question. So in 1997, there was a report called Bring Them Home. This was a commission of inquiry that the government set up, and it identified the children that were removed as a stolen generation.
Wow.
And in that report, they termed what happened, and they recognized it as a genocide, and began to look into reparation options. They instituted something called a National Sorry Day that takes place every year, and they put forth a formal apology. So there have been steps to sort of come to terms with this. What some Aboriginal scholars and activists might just say is that at this point, Aboriginal Australians have been so underprivileged and excluded from things like politics and academia, et cetera, that much more needs to be done to repair or to really bring them into equality and equal status with white Australians.
Are the New Zealanders accused of the same sort of actions against the Maori?
Oh, that's a great question. And that's a case that I haven't really studied very, very deeply. But I would say that you know, what we see with colonial settler cases, and actually Raphael Lemkin, you know, he argued that genocide takes place in two stages. First, the removal of the victim group's culture and economics and existence. And secondly, the replacement of that existence with the identity of the perpetrator group. And so some have even argued that what Hitler did with the Holocaust was actually a colonial project that took place on European soil instead of Africa. But so I would say with New Zealand, you know, anytime that we see colonial settlers, Dirk Moses, like I said, has argued that by its very structure, settler colonialism is inherently genocidal. And so I think that there are grounds to look at any case that results in either the massive population loss or extinction of an Indigenous peoples group. We need to look at that very closely.
Another student says, thank you for such an enriching lecture. Was suicide or attempting suicide common for the women that were giving birth repeatedly, only to have their children taken to boarding schools at best?
Yes, it was. There were high rates of suicide, and it's a tragic part of this and a number of other cases in Armenia. Girls and women who are raped would sometimes drown themselves in the river. We see this as one of the very few choices that victims sometimes feel that they have. And it's a sad, tragic way, but it's a way for them to claim agency and to make that decision. And sometimes women would decide not to bring a child into the world and would commit suicide while pregnant for not wanting to bring a life into the circumstances that they were finding themselves.
It was stated that using the term genocide too liberally may lower its effectiveness or power, but hasn't history shown that the first world, the United States specifically, failed to label or act on full-blown genocides as well? And do you see this as a failure in international policy?
Oh, we sure have. That's a phenomenal question. I think, unfortunately, and I think Lemkin would be devastated by what we've actually seen in terms of political will. The Genocide Convention, I think for many, many decades, has actually prohibited countries or kept them hesitant to use the word genocide because the convention comes with legal obligation to prevent or intervene in case of genocide. So we see, for example, Rwanda, a reporter having to ask how many acts of genocide does it take to make genocide? It's this, question that obviously can't even be answered. Of course, it was a genocide, but we didn't want to say so. And so I think that it's an issue of political will, unfortunately, and we do see, at least recently, we've labeled what's going on in China as a genocide. But I would say that with the question of dilution of terms, it is important that we understand what genocide means, that we understand it has a legal definition, and we also understand what it refers to as people who study genocide, so that we can really be clear about how to look for patterns, causes, and solutions. But it shouldn't be a reason to stay silent when genocide happens.
Yes, indeed. The stories of the Aboriginal girls reminds me of the show The Handmaid's Tale. Women being sold to families and reproduced and forced into labor. I'm sure that thought crossed many minds. Another question, when one group begins justifying its dominance over another group, can we expect to start seeing trafficking, slavery, and genocide? Is verbalizing dominance the first stage as a state of warning?
That's a great question. I would say that, so we have two different things. If we're looking separately at modern day slavery, it's vulnerability that we want to look for first. The key factor that determines who's most likely to be enslaved is vulnerability. And this can be, for example, a minority population that is socioeconomically disadvantaged, that doesn't have access to the same jobs, education, social or state resources as the majority population. Or this situation can change. For example, in Ukraine, right, a number of people who might previously have been completely secure in middle-class families, now all of a sudden find themselves refugees in camps and places outside of their country. And now their vulnerability is significantly higher. Now they are more likely to be trafficked. And we fear, right, an increase of trafficking on the border of Ukraine. So that's one answer. When we're looking at the times that slavery and human trafficking come hand in hand with genocide, we do absolutely want to look for those verbal statements that indicate ideas of superiority, that indicate dehumanization of a potential victim group, this euphemistic labeling, all of these things, asserting dominance or a primary position for a national, linguistic, ethnic, racial group are all indicators of risk for genocide.
Ashley, I know that being a great student of African politics and African history, you and other places in the world you look at that aren't constantly in front of our eyes as American students that would like to know more about this, where do you look in the world today that might be a hotspot?
Great question. Well, one region that I focus on, all the time with trying to keep up with the news is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And unfortunately, while it is a hotspot, I think what's sad to say is that some of the atrocities that I talked about today, but also some of the atrocities that we're seeing play out in Ukraine that are dominating our news feeds, and rightfully so, some of these atrocities have been taking place in the Congo for the last 10 years or more, and it's not grabbed our attention the way that something like the war in Ukraine has. And so this is a hot spot. It's a spot that has significant indication for instability in the Great Lakes region for the surrounding countries. And it's a place where slavery and human trafficking has increased, where vulnerability has increased, and where genocide has taken place in the last 10 to 20 years. So I would say that's a spot to watch, as well as some of these countries going through military coups right now in Western Africa are also places that are transitioning and are unstable, and those are places to keep our eye on.
Absolutely. Ashley, that was a wonderful lecture and an outstanding question and answer period, and we're so glad to have you back. And God willing, we'll have you back again next year. So
I
thank
hope
you
so.
very much.
Thank you, Diane. It's always a pleasure.
It is a pleasure for us too. Good night now.
Good night.